Good morning or afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world on this where I'm at cold, chilly day. We are so excited to be with you all and be sharing this in case you missed it session with our partners at First Group and NuBrick Partners. This session comes from our 2024 Organizational Leadership Excellence Conference that we hosted in November. So excited to have them reshare this information with you all and give you some insights into harnessing courage that will elevate your team's leadership impact. So a few reminders from the NCHL side of things. First off, my name is Jen Petit. I'm the Senior Manager for Leadership Programs with NCHL. If you have questions throughout the session for me today, you can feel free to chat those to me. I also have my email on in case you need some technical support in that way. We are recording today's session, so that will be available to all registrants after today's session. You'll receive an email with that information. We've also enabled closed captioning for today's session, so if you need that, you can access that through your Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. We'll also have some time for Q&A at the end of our session, but please feel free to use the Q&A function throughout the entire presentation, and our presenters will, I'm sure, answer those questions as they come along. I will now hand things over to Jessica Homann and Joe Mazzenga to share their presentation today. Thank you both.
Thank you, Jen. Hello, good afternoon and or morning, depending on where you might be. Thank you for joining us. We are really excited to spend this time with you and talking about how to harness courage to elevate your team's leadership impact. As Jen mentioned, I am Jessica Homann. I'm a vice president at First Group, a healthcare executive search firm in our fourth decade of providing leadership solutions to payers, providers, healthcare services, and technology companies. I'm really proud to be here today with my colleague, Joe Mazzenga, managing partner of our companion company, NuBrick Partners. NuBrick offers an integrated approach to the talent lifecycle, focusing on executive team performance and leadership development with an emphasis on what it means to be a high-performing, high-functioning enterprise leader. Now, given the nature of our services, First Group and NuBrick's work often intersects across a variety of leadership initiatives and client engagements. But one example of how we work together is when we leverage NuBrick's expertise and data-driven evaluation tools during an executive search process. This approach brings rigor to decision-making. It minimizes the risk associated with new executive appointments. It reduces bias, confirms the leader's ability to culturally contribute, and ultimately accelerates their performance and impact. Our objective today, while it will not be able to be as interactive as it was in person last month in Chicago, we do want this session to be as informative and engaging as possible through a Q&A discussion, as well as additional materials that we will provide, ultimately coming away with a high level of appreciation for leadership attributes essential to driving change and leveraging impact, an emphasis on courage, and its influence on leadership teams and culture, a tool for how to identify your blind spots and maximize strengths that will help you and your teams build courage, and also a worksheet along with our slides, as well as some additional resources and information that you can use to take further action. Through First Group's various and diverse engagements, we have really seen a shifting emphasis in the attributes necessary for leaders to be impactful. And this is primarily due to the rapid and complex changes in healthcare today. We have new technologies, processes, structures, partnerships, shifting regulations, and evolving consumer needs and expectations, all while navigating significant constraints in finances, resources, staffing. So today's healthcare executives really require a blend of skills across business acumen, leadership, as well as interpersonal and intrapersonal abilities. Effective leaders must clearly communicate long-term goals. They have to be able to align teams around future-focused visions centered on operational excellence and quality service and care. Healthcare leaders must be decisive in uncertain situations, making tough decisions, often based on incomplete data, while still maintaining a clear strategic direction. They also have to remain calm under pressure, showing resilience and adaptability in the face of challenges, sometimes having to balance authenticity with those realities while still modeling strength and confidence for their teams. And they must be bridge builders, fostering relationships, collaboration, and trust, and inspiring others to embrace change. So we could spend hours on any one of these areas, but for the purpose of our discussion today, we are going to focus on courage, which really is the foundational underpinning for all of these attributes, because without courage, we would not be able to deliver on any of these other leadership commitments. It's really through courage, leaders are able to make tough calls, advocate for change, and support their teams and their organizations effectively. Some common themes I have seen in my work with courageous leaders, really both clients and candidates, emphasizes in terms of how we've seen courage showing up in leadership. It emphasizes that courageous leaders really display openness and humility. They admit when they do not have the answers, they need help. They seek input from different perspectives. They are able to take ownership and accountability. They're able to apologize, right? Courageous leaders put principles first. There's a saying that bad leaders care about who's right, good leaders care about what's right. But we know that this doesn't always win popularity contests, especially when there are often differences of opinion or a competition for priorities or resources. But courageous leaders are willing to defend core principles even when the stakes are high, perhaps especially when the stakes are high. Courageous leaders focus on making an environment that is safe for others, because people have to feel safe to be honest with feedback and ideas, to take risks, to try new things. And it's really incumbent upon courageous leaders to foster this type of psychological safety. So courage shows up in a variety of ways, but our focus today through stories, through tools, and our interactive dialogue will really be based on feedback. Feedback is imperative to cultivating a culture of improvement, development, engagement, to really building sustainable results. But it can be incredibly uncomfortable to give and to receive. And so it does, in fact, take courage. Now, Joe, I know NuBrick sees similar themes in your assessment, your coaching, and your development work. Tell us more about how we can find and develop our courage.
Thank you, Jess. That was a great setup. I appreciate the stories and the emphasis on the importance of all of these attributes, but as courage is a driving force in the demonstration and the commitment and conviction of leading in that way. And so, since we're all about developing enterprise level leaders, courage is often required. And what we know about it is that it may not be innate. Some of us have innate skills in many areas, and some of us don't. And this is one of those that we don't want to leave to chance that you're either born with it or not. We think it's fairly developable, and it takes into account a lot of what you described as you were teeing up this conversation. And we do believe in tools to use, to leverage, and to equip leaders on their tool belt to tap into these kinds of different skills and characteristics and competencies when required. So the first one I think we talk about is notion of curiosity. You mentioned it earlier. Leaders that are curious when it comes to courage ask themselves, how come I'm holding back? What is my reluctance? What am I resisting having this conversation about or for or with? What is it saying about me? Or what is it saying about the environment or the person I'm likely to desire to have this conversation with or learn from? Curiosity is really important and one of the underrated skills in the tool belt and the arsenal of a leader. The next thing we focus on, since we don't believe all skills and competencies are innate, including courage especially. We believe in providing tools that leaders can learn, they can disseminate, they can distribute, and they can learn together with their teams to teach these tools that have sticky qualities to embed in the environment and the conversation and the relationships they have. And within those tools is a requirement to create agreement. So just when it comes time to exchanging feedback, we believe that agreements created while the sun is shining are really important to put in place. For example, if somebody comes to me or you come to me and say, Joe, I've got some feedback for you. Like, you're catching me off guard. I'm not expecting it. We don't have that kind of relationship. And now my little heart's starting to beat fast. What does this mean? But if we have an agreement, we understand, and we have a tool that we begin the process with, it's more palatable, and we would be more responsive in the process. The next thing we think about when it comes to courage is we're invested. We're invested in our development. We're invested in the development of those around us, those that we are responsible for. So that investment comes with intentionality. We're particularly putting ourselves in a situation where we gain to the experience. We're going to the gym over and over again to get better at our craft and get what we're doing. I think the next point of what's unique about the skill of courage is it requires facing into fear. Anything I've ever heard or read about people that have demonstrated remarkable courage was that it was not an absence of fear. It was something took over, some calling, some mission, some responsibility, some deep commitment to a cause, that they raised their hand, they walked into the fire, and they stepped into that fear. It requires stepping into it, and it requires doing it well, and that's where we come back to the tool. And lastly, what we think about is creating a scaffolding around feedback, since we know by all measures, the way we get better at anything in life that matters to us is through ongoing feedback. And there's feedback available to us all day long, all kinds of ways. We just want to make sure we can scaffold it to get to some critical areas that come through courage, so that ultimately we can become the best versions of ourselves as leaders. So if we move to the next slide, Jeff, first tool, or the tool that we lean on heavily in the regard of our commitment to developing leaders and equipping leaders, is this notion of the last 10%. The way that we explain this tool is that in organizations that we are familiar with, that are known for their commitment to developing talent and leadership and their cultures, invest heavily in those experiences, and almost without fail, there would be an enormous commitment to the delivery and reception of feedback in that training, in those investment dollars. But even with those companies that are phenomenally well known and committed to developing their talent, even those would leave 10% of what needs to be shared on the table. It would not go there. And organizations that aren't as committed, it's an even larger percentage of feedback that is really, really critical, and often in a career opportunity or a career derailer if not understood. And the last 10%, quite honestly, in some ways is a little bit difficult to describe, but it's cringy kinds of experiences that you might have with somebody. It's the behavior, it's their attitude, it's something they say or what they don't say, or something about their persona or the way they show up that you see. You may talk about it with colleagues, but you may not have the courage or the freedom or the agreement to step into. And it's a career limiter. And I think we believe that in our organizations, in both of our organizations, the kindest thing we can do for people is to tell them the truth. We're not serving them by withholding. So let me tell you a story, and then we'll go into unpacking the tool a bit. So several years ago, I received an inquiry from a healthcare system CEO who was going to introduce me to a chair of a prestigious AMC in the country, who wanted to meet with me. This chair wanted to meet with me because he was nearing his retirement age. And I learned through this initial conversation with the system CEO that he had an potential internal successor to succeed him in his succession plan. So I agreed to meet with the chair of the department, this remarkable individual who, in his 35-year run, had revolutionized the department and had significant contributions to research and clinical outcomes that are just so well known in this country. And so he sat down with me and he said, I'd like to think about hiring you to work with, I'll call him Greg. Greg is my potential internal successor. This is the Department of Neurosurgery, and he is a well-known clinician here in the department. He grew up here. He has been effective in all opportunities and dimensions that he has been offered to step into since he's been a part of this department about 20 years. So I'd like you to spend some time with him, grooming him and engaging him in executive coaching relations to prepare him and evaluate him. I said that would be great. I would be honored to be a part of this. This transition is really important for your life. So I said, so he went on and on about his outcomes and his traits and his personality and his attributes and all of his success. And I said, are any challenges that he may have? And he said, yeah, there is one. We see, and I was caught by the word we see a pattern in his behavior that's concerning to us. I said, what's that? He said that when you're in a meeting with him, you're in the OR, you're in a clinic, you're in a hallway, you're in the office, you be in an engaged conversation with him, and then all of a sudden, just show me what you do if I'm having this conversation. So I'm talking, and we're having this great conversation, and all of a sudden, he looks away for seemingly like a long period of time, just like that, Jess. I said, wow. And he demonstrated that to me. I said, so what does that mean? What's your interpretation?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've come to understand that whoever that person is that entered this physical space is more important than me or us at that moment. Wow. Okay. So how has he responded to your feedback when you gave him this feedback about this particular behavior? Oh, no. We didn't give him that feedback. Oh, so you want me to give him that feedback? And how am I supposed to know that he does? Right. So I wasn't about to walk away from that opportunity. So I stepped into the relationship, and fortuitously, within about a month or so, we were having dinner at a wonderful restaurant seated near the entrance of the restaurant, sitting face to face in a booth, having a wonderful conversation, and the front door opened, and lo and behold, he turned away, and what seemed like a couple of minutes, he was locked into that person. And I said to him, say, who is that? Well, that's so-and-so, so-and-so, very important person. I said, wow, it feels like you left the table. You left me in the conversation. And he says to me, I do that all the time. Wow. What an opportunity. I said, well, I think we should work on that for the implications of how that felt. And we proceeded, and within 18 months, he was given the opportunity, and he thrived, and he's done very well. And he looks in the mirror, and he takes into account what the implications are of his leadership. So that's the last 10%. There are other opportunities. Jeff, I know you have a powerful story to tell at the end, but that's an example of the last 10. That was being withheld from him that ultimately would have been a career derailer. We have those in us. We have those in people that are around us. We know what they are, and if we had more time, we could get into describing them. But if we take a quick inventory, we know there are aspects of people's personality that will hinder their impact, effectiveness, and career trajectory. So Jess, when we go about teaching the tools, we have several steps. Number one, we think about the fact that we have to establish psychological safety. Anywhere, anytime, feedback is going to be delivered or received, psychological safety is imperative. And we don't leave it to chance, and it's not something magical that appears. This is where we create agreements, which we'll talk about in a second. We create agreements while the sun is shining, so that when we are approached or invited, we understand what's coming. When we do engage in a last 10% conversation, we do have to step into courage because it's a bit uncomfortable. We do need to be diplomatic and tactful. It is absolutely required. In fact, to ask for and receive feedback requires courage. You got anything for me? So in teams that we embed this in and invite them to engage in, we ask them to begin to say, Jess, you have the last 10 for me, or Jess, would you like the last 10? I have something for you. Then it's powerful because we know it's coming. That's the agreement we set up in advance, so you know I'm not broadsided by this request or invitation. I'm actually coming for it, listening for it, so pay attention. Ultimately, it demonstrates a commitment to each other's success. If you're committed to going there and being courageous with me, it means the world to me that you took the risk to share that with me. Now, when we do receive it, when it is coming our way, it's imperative that we start to respond with these two words. Thank you. May I have more? Is there more? We get really clever when we become defensive, when we say, well, I'm just explaining myself. Yeah, you're explaining yourself, better known as defensive. Just listen, acknowledge, and if you respond well, there will be more forthcoming. If you snap and you shut down the conversation, that may be the last time you hear the invitation coming your way, which you deserve to hear. So that's the tool. It's the last 10. We embed it in teams. They use it for years on end. They use it in their conversations, in their development planning, in the building of their teams and relationships. Very powerful. So Jess, as you and I have traveled this path before, tell us a very important story that you experienced.
Thank you, Joe. At first, can I just circle back to Greg? I have to say, sometimes there are blind spots that we truly are unaware of, and we need to have them brought to our attention.
Exactly.
And other times, like in Greg's case, we know these things about us, right?
Yep.
And yet there's still a real gift in sometimes, people drawing them out to say that they are also not just aware of them, but impacted by them.
Yeah.
That's one of the aspects of that story about Greg that I appreciate is he knew this to be true, but that feedback was still so helpful for him being able to make a shift.
Yeah. Jess, let me add something. That's a very important point. The blinds we all have, the National Center for Creative Leadership research says that everybody has 2.5 blind spots. So what are yours? What are mine? And therefore we need to have grace on each other for the fact that we don't. Secondly, in the case of the story I told, some of us minimize our behavior, our style. We don't recognize the implications and impact that they are having, even if we do know how. In this case, he did know, but he discounted the impact that would have. So it's all rich feedback and opportunity.
Yeah. Well, in terms of my story, so and so much of what you just shared, Joe, around the framework for the last 10% is exemplified in my story. So earlier in my career, I was leading a system CEO search and presenting candidates to a search committee comprised of mostly male board members. And that factor plays a bit of a role and aspect, I think, in some of the dynamics of this story. But during the meeting, one of the stakeholders asked a question about one of the candidates. And I provided a very clear and thoughtful answer, and we moved on. Well, about 10 to 15 minutes later, my colleague, who also happened to be a male and who happened to be in a more senior role than me, re-raised that same question. But instead of offering new insights or something additive, he proceeded to essentially give the exact same answer I had already provided. And it was confusing, it was awkward, and honestly, it was frustrating. And so after the meeting, I knew I had to address it. And I reached out to my colleague, I gave him the feedback. And in doing so, I also explained that while it's never okay for anyone to take credit for someone else's ideas or responses, it becomes particularly problematic when a man, especially one in a more senior role, does that to a woman, and especially in front of a mostly male audience. And it was incredibly uncomfortable for me to say this to him. And I'm sure it was equally, if not more so, uncomfortable for him to hear it. But I knew that I had the psychological safety to give him this feedback. I knew there would be no blowback or retribution for speaking up. I knew he would care about my experience and how I felt. And his response was just simple, and it was full of grace. He listened, he took ownership, and he said two words that really demonstrated his leadership. Joe, you want to take a guess at what those were?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, he did say that actually, but he also said thank you. So, Joe, I think that was one of your points. Thank you and reflect versus explanation and defensiveness. It's so true. It becomes easy to try to explain yourself in a way that waters down the gift of the feedback that is being presented to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So as we kind of continue on here, we have a reflection exercise for the audience. And really, what we invite you to do with these suggestions is really to take some time to consider them and maybe even exactly what the slide suggests, exercise them. So maybe get with someone that you trust and maybe confide in, and talk with them, talk through a time when you demonstrated or you witnessed courageous leadership. What is a time when you recognize that happened, and how did it affect you or impact the outcome in the situation? Maybe you want to describe or think through a time when you wished you had demonstrated courageous leadership and maybe you did not. So maybe in reflection, it was a lesson learned, something you would now do differently. Or perhaps there's a time in the near future that you know is on the horizon where you're going to have the opportunity to demonstrate courageous leadership, or maybe even just counsel somebody else who you know might need it. Another aspect that you can reflect on and think through is who you can ask for the last 10%.
Yeah.
And what commitment will you make today based on what you've learned, what you've heard, and even the pending Q&A that we'll engage in, and other revelations that will come from that you will leverage moving forward, both in your leadership, but also in supporting some of your leadership teams. Joe, anything you would like to add?
I think it's, when I think about a time when you wish you had, the second or third bullet, a time when you wish you had and you did not. I think we can look back in our roles and say, where did I give 80%? Where did I get 75%? How do I take that? Where do I go to close that gap? How do I need to revisit that conversation for the impact that it might have on this person who deserves to hear it? And how do I set them up with this notion of the last 10% before I just barge in? So take that opportunity. We all can be better. If you know you know what we can be, we must be. And so I think there's an opportunity with these questions to revisit where we've been.
Absolutely. I just want to call out that Jen is dropping into the chat a link to some of the workshop resources. So please check that out. And please know too that this part of today is really our favorite. It's the opportunity for reflections and questions. So comments, observations, curiosities, we're here for it. We're looking forward to engaging now in an active dialogue with all of you, which Jen will help. And just so we can be a little bit more visible, I am going to stop sharing at this time. Please drop your questions, Jen, right in the chat. Is that where they should do that?
in the Q&A function. So you should see a Q&A question mark box in the
Oh,
bottom
yeah.
of your Zoom screen.
And we're very comfortable with silence, so we're happy to wait.
Are we comfortable with the last 10% if somebody has that for us?
Oh, yes, that's true. Yes,
Okay.
we must
Let's get ready.
practice what we preach, Joe.
That's right.
Joe, while questions are, I'm sure, being populated, one of the things that I'm curious to kind of get us going is how can leaders sort of ensure that feedback is a tool for growth versus criticism?
I think it comes down to this notion of establishing a vision for creating a culture of development. And in development, there's critical feedback, there's affirmation, there's encouragement, there's feedback saying something like, Jess, I'm aware of your superpower. Let me tell you what I think it is that you can step into more and more and more. So I think it is about the balance of it, and with this investment and commitment in developing somebody else, but setting up the atmosphere and the agreements in advance that this is coming. I worked as a clinician in my first career with couples, and oftentimes they didn't have agreements for engaging in feedback, but they were nonetheless sharing a lot of feedback that was not landing well. So we had to back that up and figure out how do we create agreements so that we know what to expect, we know the intent, and we know the commitment.
That's excellent.
Jess, we led this workshop not too long ago at a different conference, and I remember somebody stood up at one point in the live audience and said, I have a last 10%. And she went on to describe an executive on the executive team that routinely, when somebody entered the office, the space, or the room, would size them up from head to toe and from toe to head, males and females. And it was very cringy and very uncomfortable as she described it. And what she conveyed is that no one had shared this with him. And that's a career derailer, and that's not fair, whether it was a blind spot, whether he's aware of it, it ultimately doesn't matter. I think it needs to be told, and it needs to be told respectfully and diplomatically. But that would be a great example of, okay, who wants to deal with that? But nonetheless, very important.
Right, for sure. Any questions from the group? It looks like we've got several participants. What can we further unpack with you?
Yeah, or answer.
Yeah. Joe, another question I think that I have heard before. I think empathy is a really important part of the feedback process. But I'm wondering, in a leadership role and dynamic, how can leaders sort of balance empathy but with accountability? Do you have thoughts on that?
No, I do, and that's a tough one. And I think empathy for the times that we find ourselves in is a very important skill to learn to understand. And again, I think some people are more innately empathetic and know how to deliver that, but nonetheless, it's very, very powerful. So there is this notion of empathy sounds like, of course, and I understand, and you make sense, and I get it. Accountability is a different tactic and tool that I think unfortunately is often used as a blunt stick or a blunt object or a stick. Jess, you better get those salespeople accountable to your end. Doesn't sound very empathetic.
Right.
So I think there's a place to build earlier on in the relationship. What does empathy sound like? Of course, you're challenged. How can I help you? And accountability is, to me, more about what are you doing on purpose to be more effective day in and day out versus having somebody come to you
Mm-hmm.
and have to have this hard conversation about your results that you aren't achieving. So I think it's a little bit, it's difficult, but I think they're both, they do come together, but they're important to unpack and figure
Yeah.
out how do we deliver those as meaningful as possible. You don't want people running from that
Right.
word accountability. We know we need it.
We have a great question, Joe. Sorry, Jen, I don't know
No,
if you're
go
going
for
to
it.
be filling these. What do you do if you don't agree with the feedback that you're being given?
You say thank you.
This is exactly what we're talking about. So even when you don't agree, the response is thank you.
The response is thank you, and I have two thoughts. One is you say thank you, and you say I appreciate you, I respect you coming to me, if you can say that, and I will give a great deal of thought to what you're sharing with me. It may be uncomfortable, but here's what's important when it comes to feedback that you keep in mind in your own development as a person who may be delivering or receiving feedback. In the face of feedback, people typically respond in one of three ways beyond the thank you and the receptivity. They respond by thinking to themselves, this feedback is woefully inaccurate. I wasn't 15 minutes late, I was 9 minutes late. So it's not precise.
Semantics.
Number two, I don't respect this person who is giving me this feedback. So therefore, I'm diluting and minimizing it. And third of all, what they're sharing with me is completely out of character for anything I've ever known or heard about myself. So we have the capacity to dismiss the feedback in those three ways. But again, you may be shutting off an opportunity to hear something because of what you might be hearing is a blind spot. So that's why I go back to, don't be tricky, don't engage in those three steps. Say thank you, let me ponder it. Can you share more?
That's great.
It takes courage to give it, and it takes courage to receive it.
Jen, I didn't want to step on your toes, so.
No, you're on a roll.
Okay.
You're on a roll. Go for it. Absolutely.
I'm just curious. So I thought this is a very interesting question. Do our feedback mechanisms change with clinical versus non-clinical leaders or team members? And I know that you've got experience working with, but well, we all do, but in your particular role with your education and training, Joe, you've dealt with both. What say you?
I would love to have a conversation to hear where that's coming from contextually. I don't think of delivering feedback differently to clinicians versus non-clinicians. If you're talking about positions in leadership roles, which I have a great deal of direct experience currently with, they step into leadership roles without a lot of requisite tools to lead and manage organizations and people, including feedback. So I think we have to be respectful and thoughtful and prepare them for that. Secondly, I think if you're talking about physicians, they grew up in a very rich feedback experience. They were apprentices for a very long time. They got a lot of feedback on what they did every single day, over and over and over and over again. So feedback is very, very familiar to them. It's dependent on how it was served up, but make no mistake, they mastered their craft through feedback. So I would love to know more about that, but I don't see a distinct difference.
That's great.
If you make the agreements and create that.
Sure, following that framework. This question really reminds me of my story a bit. It says, what is your advice for incorporating courage for early careers who may have feedback for senior leaders where a power differential may exist? There may be a fear about negatively impacting future career opportunities by questioning or providing feedback to senior leaders. And that resonates with me because the story I told was earlier in my career, there was a power differential, but I knew I had psychological safety. And what I'm hearing in this question maybe is, what if you don't know that you don't have it, but you also don't know that you do? You know, what's your take on that, Joe?
I think, it's interesting, Jess, we do know intuitively and innately, we know if we have psychological safety or not. We don't, Amazon doesn't create some kind of barometer that we walk around with and it, goes off when it's unsafe. We know that. But I do think early careers might be, we also can sense insincere, and we also sometimes our intuition would tell us, oh, you're giving me 80%. Some of us, some people that struggle with feedback I've seen people that I've coached that they're so distressed about feedback that they're actually separating somebody from the organization, but they do it in such a way that the person thinks they're getting a promotion, which ultimately doesn't serve them. Somebody else is going to have to go back and clean that up. So I do think we do have to be respectful. We do have to be thoughtful, empathetic, diplomatic, and all of that. But I do think we need to be truthful, because last time I checked, we get better when we hear the truth. Any others? Great questions.
Yeah, it looks like there is one more, Joe. When providing feedback, this person says, I've often heard we should balance it out with compliments, but sometimes this comes off sounding insincere or forced, which I agree.
Yeah.
How can we keep things positive when providing feedback while still being genuine? That's a great question.
Yeah. We teach another tool, and it's this, and it's, we don't have time to go into it. We're at the end of our time, but it is this notion of creating agreements with people to convey to them opportunities where they could be even better.
Mm-hmm.
And setting that expectation up. So at the end of this conversation, Jess, I could come to you and say, what could I have done differently or better? So neurologically, what we understand about feedback is when we invite it, it's far less intimidating or anxiety producing versus, some of us grew up in school with on the word on the classroom board were scary. See me after class, Joe. That was going to be feedback, and everybody knew it was coming. So when we present it in such a way where it's about being even better, it's far more productive and receptive and palatable.
That's the even better if tool, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Great questions.
Great question. And we welcome any feedback too.
That's right.
For sure.
Commitment to continuous improvement and learning.
Yeah.
Development. So many things that the NCHL represents and fosters in the industry, which we appreciate. We do have a couple more minutes, but any other questions? Comments? Feedback?
Snide remarks.
Sarcasm? Oh, no, everybody, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Wishing you a wonderful rest of your day and week. And we look forward to perhaps connecting with you through some of the resources. Happy to always continue the conversation. So please reach out if we can support you in any way.
Yeah. And Jen, as you said, this is recorded so people can tap into it.
That's
Absolutely.
right.
Yeah, we'll be sending the recording by the end of the week. So.
Right. You could use it with your team and share this as a tool that we could commit to as a team. That would be very powerful next step.
Absolutely. Thank you both.
Wish everybody a wonderful holiday and a great new year.
Yes. Take care. Thank you.
Thank
you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.